The dusty trail outside Amarillo, Texas stretched endlessly behind Grace Sutherland as she walked with what little dignity remained to her. Her worn carpetbag clutched in both hands and tears she refused to shed burning behind her eyes. The August sun of 1878 beat down mercilessly on her broad shoulders, and she could still hear her brother's cruel words echoing in her mind, still see the disgust on her sister-in-law's pinched face as they'd told her she was no longer welcome in the only home she'd known since their parents died. Too much food, they'd said. Too much expense. Too much embarrassment when the neighbors came calling and saw her substantial frame taking up space in their parlor. Her own blood had turned her out onto the unforgiving Texas plains with $20 and a warning never to return. Grace was 23 years old, and for the first time in her life, she was completely alone. The road ahead shimmered in the afternoon heat, and Grace's feet ached in her too tight boots. She'd walked for 3 hours since her brother Robert had dropped her at the edge of town, barely slowing his wagon long enough for her to climb down before he'd snapped the reins and disappeared back toward the family ranch. She hadn't looked back, wouldn't give him the satisfaction. But now, with the sun climbing higher and her water nearly gone, Grace wondered if her pride would be the death of her. She'd made it perhaps another mile when she heard the sound of hoofbeats behind her. Grace's heart hammered in her chest as she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting Robert to have returned with more hateful words. Instead, she saw a lone rider approaching at an easy canter, a tall man on a paint horse with a dusty brown hat pulled low over his eyes. Grace stepped to the side of the road, keeping her gaze down as any proper woman would. The rider slowed as he drew near, and she could feel his eyes on her. "Afternoon, madam," came a deep voice, rough but not unkind. "That's a long walk you're taking in this heat." Grace kept her eyes on her boots. "I'm managing just fine, thank you." There was a pause, and she heard the creak of leather as the man shifted in his saddle. "Begging your pardon, madam, but you don't look fine. You look about ready to drop. Where you headed?" "Anywhere that isn't here," Grace said before she could stop herself. The words came out bitter, and she immediately regretted her sharp tongue. This stranger didn't deserve her anger. The rider was quiet for a moment. Then she heard him dismount, his boots hitting the packed earth with a soft thud. "Name's Harrison Xenon," he said. "I've got water if you need it, and I'd be happy to see you somewhere safe. This ain't the kind of road a lady should be walking alone." Grace finally looked up, and her breath caught despite herself. Harrison Xenon was perhaps 26 or 27, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of creek water. A few days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw, and his clothes were dusty from long hours in the saddle, but there was something steady in his gaze that made her want to trust him. Something decent. "I don't have money for passage," Grace said quietly, "and I don't take charity." Harrison's expression didn't change. "Didn't ask for money, and I wasn't offering charity, just common decency. You look like you've had a hard day, and I happen to be headed toward town. No sense in you walking when there's a horse right here." Grace's throat tightened. She wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain what little pride she had left, but the truth was her feet were bleeding inside her boots and her head was starting to swim from the heat. If she collapsed out here, she'd be worse than useless. She'd be dead. "All right," she said finally. "Thank you." Harrison nodded and uncapped his canteen, holding it out to her. Grace took it with trembling hands and drank deeply, the warm water tasting better than anything she could remember. When she handed it back, Harrison secured it to his saddle and then studied her for a moment. "You can ride behind me," he said. "It's not the most comfortable arrangement, but it'll get you where you're going." Grace felt her cheeks burn with shame. She knew what he was thinking, what he must be seeing. A woman her size would be no easy burden for any horse. "Your horse," she began, but Harrison held up a hand. "Thunder's carried me and full packs through worse terrain than this," he said simply. "He'll be just fine." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. Grace blinked hard and nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Harrison mounted first, then reached down to help her up. It took some maneuvering, and Grace's face burned hotter with every awkward moment. But finally she was settled behind him, her carpetbag clutched against her chest and her body rigid with the effort of taking up as little space as possible. "You can hold on," Harrison said over his shoulder. "I won't bite, and you won't hurt me." Hesitantly, Grace shifted her carpetbag to one arm and placed her free hand lightly on Harrison's shoulder. He made a small sound that might have been amusement and reached back to guide her other arm around his waist. "That's better," he said. "Now hold on proper, because Thunder's got a mind to get home before dark." With that, he urged the horse into a smooth walk, and Grace found herself pressed against the solid warmth of Harrison's back, breathing in the scent of leather and sage and honest sweat. It should have been mortifying, riding this close to a strange man, but instead, Grace felt something she hadn't felt in months. Safe. They rode in silence for a while, the steady rhythm of Thunder's hooves almost hypnotic. Grace's exhaustion began to catch up with her, and she found her head drooping forward until it rested against Harrison's shoulder blade. She jerked upright immediately, but he didn't seem to notice or care. "You got family in Amarillo?" Harrison asked after a time. Grace's jaw tightened. "No." "Friends?" "No." Another pause. "You running from something or towards something?" "From," Grace said before she could think better of it. Then, because he'd been kind and because the words were burning inside her, she added, "My brother decided he didn't want the burden of feeding me anymore. Said I was an embarrassment, too fat, too ugly, too expensive to keep." She felt Harrison's back stiffen beneath her hands. "Your brother's a fool," he said flatly. The unexpected defense brought tears to Grace's eyes. She blinked them back furiously. "You don't have to say that." "I don't say things I don't mean," Harrison replied. "Any man who'd turn out his own sister over something like that isn't worth the air he breathes. Family's supposed to mean something." "Not to everyone," Grace said quietly. Harrison was silent for a moment. Then he said, "My folks died when I was 16. Cholera took them both within a week of each other. I've been on my own ever since, working ranches and trail drives, saving up to start something of my own. I'd give just about anything to have family again, and here your brother throws his away like it's nothing." He shook his head. "Makes me sick." Grace felt something shift in her chest. "I'm sorry about your parents." "Ancient history now," Harrison said, but she could hear the old grief in his voice. "Point is, I understand a bit about being alone, and I understand that blood doesn't always mean family. Sometimes family is what you make it, not what you're born into." The words settled over Grace like a blanket, warm and unexpected. She didn't respond, couldn't find the words, but she allowed herself to hold on a little tighter to this stranger who'd shown her more kindness in an hour than her own brother had in the last year. They reached Amarillo as the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The town wasn't much, just a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street, but it looked like civilization after the long, empty road. Harrison guided Thunder toward a modest hotel near the center of town and dismounted, then helped Grace down with the same quiet courtesy he'd shown from the start. Grace's legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, and Harrison steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "Easy," he said. "You need food and rest." "I need to find work," Grace said, trying to sound stronger than she felt, "and a place to stay that I can afford." Harrison studied her for a moment, his creek-water eyes thoughtful. Then he seemed to come to a decision. "Come on," he said, picking up her carpet bag before she could protest. "Let's get you settled first, then we can talk about the rest." Grace wanted to argue, but exhaustion was dragging at her bones. She followed Harrison into the hotel, a small establishment with a tired-looking clerk behind the front desk. The clerk looked up as they entered, his gaze sliding over Grace with barely concealed disdain before settling on Harrison. "Help you?" the clerk asked. "Need a room for the lady," Harrison said evenly. "Something clean and quiet." The clerk's eyebrows rose. "That's so." His eyes flicked to Grace again. "We only got one vacancy and it's $2 a night." Grace felt her stomach sink. $2 a night would eat through her money in less than 2 weeks, even if she didn't spend a penny on food. But before she could speak, Harrison was already pulling coins from his pocket. "I'll take it for a week," he said, counting out the money onto the counter. "No," Grace said sharply. "I can't accept that." Harrison turned to her, his expression patient. "Consider it a loan, then. You can pay me back when you get on your feet." "I don't even know you," Grace protested, though her heart was hammering at the thought of a real bed, a real room, a place to rest her aching body. "Then you can get to know me," Harrison said simply. He turned back to the clerk. "The room, please." The clerk shrugged and took the money, handing over a key with obvious reluctance. "Up the stairs, second door on the left. Breakfast is extra." Harrison took the key and guided Grace toward the stairs, his hand light on her back. She was too tired to argue further, too overwhelmed by the strange turn her day had taken. This morning she'd been cast out by the only family she had left. Now a cowboy she'd met on the road was paying for her lodging and treating her with more respect than she'd received in months. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the street. Grace set her carpetbag on the bed and turned to find Harrison still standing in the doorway, hat in hand. "I'm at the boarding house down the street," he said. "Mrs. Walker's place. You need anything, you come find me there." "I'll be in town for at least the next few weeks, working at the Henderson Ranch just outside town." Grace swallowed hard. "Why are you doing this?" Harrison met her eyes. "Because somebody should," he said quietly. "Because you deserved better than what you got today, and because I can help." "It's as simple as that." "Nothing's ever simple," Grace said, but her voice was softer than she intended. "Maybe not," Harrison agreed. He settled his hat back on his head and gave her a small nod. "Get some rest, Miss Sutherland. Things'll look better in the morning." "Grace," she said impulsively. "You can call me Grace." A smile tugged at the corner of Harrison's mouth, the first real smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his weathered face, making him look younger and somehow more approachable. "Grace," he repeated. "Pretty name, suits you." Then he was gone, his boots echoing on the stairs as he descended, and Grace was alone in the tiny room. She sank onto the bed and finally allowed herself to cry, great racking sobs that she muffled in her hands. She cried for her parents, gone 6 years now. She cried for her brother's cruelty and her own helplessness. But somewhere beneath the grief and shame, there was a tiny spark of something else, something that felt almost like hope. The next morning, Grace woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the unfamiliar comfort of clean sheets. For a moment she didn't remember where she was, and then it all came flooding back. The long walk, Harrison Xenon, the unexpected kindness of a stranger. She rose and washed her face in the basin, studying herself in the small mirror above the washstand. Her dark hair was tangled, her face pale except for the sunburn on her nose and cheeks. Her brown eyes were red-rimmed from crying, and her body was the same heavy, ungainly shape it had always been. Grace looked away quickly, the old shame rising like bile in her throat. But she couldn't hide in this room forever. She needed to find work, needed to figure out how to survive in this town with no connections and no skills beyond basic housekeeping and cooking. Grace dressed in her cleanest shirtwaist and skirt, both faded and patched but respectable, and pinned up her hair as neatly as she could manage. Then she made her way downstairs, her stomach growling despite her nervousness. The hotel clerk was different this morning, an older woman with kind eyes who smiled at Grace as she approached the desk. "Good morning, dear. You're the young lady Harrison brought in last night, aren't you?" Grace nodded, surprised that the woman knew. "Yes, madam." "He's a good man, that one," the woman said. "Works hard, treats people decent. You're lucky he found you." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "Between you and me, my husband who worked the desk last night is a judgmental old goat. Don't pay him any mind." The unexpected warmth loosened something in Grace's chest. "Thank you," she said softly. "Now you look like you could use some breakfast. The restaurant next door serves a decent meal and they're usually looking for help if you're seeking work." Grace's heart leaped. "They are, sure are. Cook's getting old and needs someone to help with prep work and washing up. Doesn't pay much, but it includes meals. You should talk to Mr. Chen. Tell him Betty from the hotel sent you." Grace thanked the woman profusely and hurried next door before her courage could fail her. The restaurant was a small establishment with a half-dozen tables and the smell of bacon and coffee filling the air. A middle-aged Chinese man was working behind the counter, and he looked up as Grace entered. "Help you?" he asked, his English accented but clear. "Mrs. Betty said you might be looking for help," Grace said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I can cook and clean, and I'm a hard worker." Mr. Chen studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he said, "You work today, we see how you do, if good, job is yours. 50 cents a day plus meals." "Deal, deal," Grace said quickly before he could change his mind. Mr. Chen nodded and gestured toward the back. "Come, I show you kitchen." The kitchen was hot and cramped, but Grace fell into the work like she'd been doing it all her life. She'd learned to cook at her mother's side, and the skills came back easily despite the years since she'd been allowed to do more than basic chores at her brother's house. Mr. Chen set her to peeling potatoes and washing dishes, watching her carefully as she worked. By noon, Grace was sweating and exhausted, but she'd kept up with everything Mr. Chen had asked of her. He brought her a plate of rice and vegetables and nodded approvingly. "You do good work," he said. "Job is yours if you want it." "I want it," Grace said, relief flooding through her. "Thank you, Mr. Chen. You won't regret this." "I know I won't," Mr. Chen said. "You start tomorrow, 6 in the morning." Grace spent the rest of the day exploring Amarillo, familiarizing herself with the town that would be her home for the foreseeable future. It was a working town, dusty and rough, but with a certain vitality that Grace found appealing. Cowboys and ranchers passed through regularly, and there was a steady stream of wagons carrying goods between the ranches and the railroad. It wasn't much, but it was a place where a woman could make her own way if she was willing to work hard. As evening approached, Grace found herself walking past Mrs. Walker's boarding house, the place Harrison had mentioned. She told herself she was just being thorough in her exploration of the town, but her eyes searched the front porch and windows all the same, looking for a familiar face. Grace. She turned to find Harrison approaching from the opposite direction, his hat pushed back and his shirt dusty from a day's work. He smiled when he saw her, and Grace felt her heart do a strange little skip in her chest. "How was your first day?" Harrison asked, falling into step beside her. "Good," Grace said, unable to keep the satisfaction from her voice. "I found work at the restaurant next to the hotel. I start tomorrow morning." Harrison's smile widened. "That's wonderful. Mr. Chen's a fair man to work for. You'll do well there." They walked together in comfortable silence for a moment, and Grace found herself acutely aware of Harrison's presence beside her. He was tall enough that she had to look up slightly to see his face, and there was something solid and reassuring about the way he moved, confident but not cocky. "Have you eaten dinner?" Harrison asked after a moment. "Not yet," Grace admitted. "Neither have I. Would you do me the honor of joining me? There's a little place at the end of town that makes excellent stew." Grace hesitated, her old insecurities rising. She could imagine what people would think, seeing her eating in public, probably making assumptions about how much she would consume. But Harrison was looking at her with such open friendliness that she couldn't bring herself to refuse. "I'd like that," she said quietly. The restaurant Harrison led her to was indeed small, just a handful of tables in what had probably once been someone's home. The woman who ran it was round and cheerful, greeting Harrison like an old friend and showing them to a table near the window. "You've been here before," Grace observed as they settled into their seats. "A few times," Harrison admitted. "Mrs. Patterson's cooking reminds me of my mother's. That's high praise coming from me." The food, when it arrived, was hearty and delicious, and Grace found herself eating with more appetite than she'd had in weeks. Harrison kept up an easy conversation, telling her about his work at the Henderson Ranch and asking about her plans for settling into town. He didn't ask about her family again, seeming to understand that the topic was painful. "So you're saving up to start your own ranch?" Grace asked between bites of stew. Harrison nodded. "That's the plan. I've been working and saving for nearly 10 years now. I'm close, finally. There's a piece of land about 20 miles north of here that I've got my eye on. Good water, decent grazing. Just need another year or two of steady work, and I'll have enough to make an offer." There was such quiet determination in his voice that Grace couldn't help but be impressed. "That sounds wonderful. It's just a dream for now," Harrison said, but she could see the longing in his eyes. "But it's a dream I intend to make real. I'm tired of working other people's land, building other people's herds. I want something that's mine." "I understand that," Grace said softly. "More than you might think." Harrison met her eyes across the table. "I expect you do." They finished their meal as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold. Harrison walked Grace back to the hotel, and they paused on the front steps. "Thank you for dinner," Grace said. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Harrison said, "but I wanted to. You're interesting to talk to, Grace. I hope we can do this again sometime." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "I'd like that too." Harrison tipped his hat to her and turned to leave, but Grace found herself calling after him. "Harrison," he turned back, eyebrows raised. "Yes. Why did you help me yesterday? Really?" Harrison was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he said, "My mother used to tell me that we're measured by how we treat people who can't do anything for us in return. She said that kindness is free, but it's also the most valuable thing we can give." He paused. "And maybe because I saw someone who needed help and I had helped to give. Sometimes it's that simple." "You're a good man, Harrison Xenon," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm trying to be," Harrison said. "Sleep well, Grace." Grace watched him walk away into the gathering darkness, and for the first time since her brother had cast her out, she felt like maybe, just maybe, things were going to be all right. The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Grace rose before dawn to begin work at Mr. Chen's restaurant, spending long hours in the hot kitchen preparing meals and cleaning up afterward. The work was hard and her feet ached by the end of each day, but there was a satisfaction in it that she'd never felt doing chores at her brother's ranch. This was honest work, and she was earning her own way. Harrison stopped by the restaurant most mornings before heading out to the Henderson Ranch, always ordering coffee and whatever breakfast Mr. Chen had prepared. He'd sit at the counter and talk with Grace while she worked, telling her stories about the ranch and the men he worked with. He had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard sometimes, making her laugh despite herself. Other customers noticed their easy rapport, and Grace sometimes caught curious glances from the regulars. A few of the women whispered behind their hands when they thought Grace couldn't hear, their voices carrying just enough for her to catch words like desperate and charity case. Grace tried to ignore them, tried to focus on her work and not let the old shame take root, but it was hard. She'd lived with judgment her whole life, and it seemed that even a new town couldn't completely escape it. Harrison, she noticed, had no patience for such gossip. One morning about 2 weeks after Grace had started working, a cowboy at one of the tables made a crude comment just loud enough to carry. Something about how Harrison must be awfully lonely to be courting a woman built like a plow horse. Grace felt her face burn and her hands stilled in the dishwater. Before she could react, Harrison was on his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He crossed to the cowboy's table in 3 long strides, his expression dangerous. "What did you say?" Harrison asked quietly, but there was steel in his voice. The cowboy, younger than Harrison and probably thinking himself brave in front of his friends, opened his mouth to repeat himself. He didn't get the chance. Harrison grabbed him by the front of his shirt and hauled him to his feet. "Let me make something clear," Harrison said, his voice low and controlled. "Grace Sutherland is a lady, and you'll treat her with respect or you'll answer to me. And if I hear you've said one more word about her, you're going to find yourself eating your meals through a straw for the next month." "We understand each other," the cowboy, his bravado crumbling in the face of Harrison's cold fury, nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, I'm sorry. I didn't mean nothing by it." "Then you'll apologize to the lady," Harrison said, not releasing his grip. The cowboy turned to Grace, his face red. "I apologize, madam. That was out of line." Grace, her heart pounding, managed a stiff nod. Harrison held the cowboy's gaze for another long moment, then released him and returned to his seat as if nothing had happened. The restaurant had gone silent, every eye on them, but Harrison simply picked up his coffee cup and took a sip, utterly composed. Mr. Chen caught Grace's eye from the kitchen and gave her a small, approving nod. The other customers slowly returned to their meals and conversations, though Grace noticed several people looking at her with new consideration. When Harrison finished his breakfast and came to pay, Grace followed him to the door. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," Harrison replied, his jaw still tight. "Nobody talks about you that way, not while I'm around." "People will think we're courting now," Grace said, trying to keep her voice light despite the way her stomach was fluttering. Harrison looked at her steadily. "Would that be so terrible?" Grace's breath caught. "Harrison." "I'm not saying we are," Harrison said quickly, "but I'm not saying I'd be opposed to it either. You're smart and funny and you work harder than anyone I know. Any man would be lucky to have your attention." He paused. "I know I would be." Before Grace could respond, Harrison settled his hat on his head and stepped out into the morning sunshine, leaving Grace standing in the doorway with her heart racing and her thoughts in chaos. That evening, Grace lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, Harrison's words replaying in her mind. He'd defended her honor in front of the whole restaurant. He'd suggested, however carefully, that he might be interested in courting her. It seemed impossible, like something from the dime novels she'd read as a girl. Men like Harrison Xenon didn't court women like her. They married pretty delicate women who fit properly into their lives and their futures, but Harrison had never treated her as anything less than worthy. From the moment he'd stopped on that dusty road, he'd shown her nothing but respect and kindness. He'd paid for her room without asking for anything in return. He'd made sure she found work. He'd become her friend when she desperately needed one. And now, maybe, he was offering something more. Grace rolled onto her side and hugged her pillow close. She was terrified to hope, terrified to believe that someone might actually want her not despite her size but simply for who she was. But Harrison's creek water eyes had been so sincere, his words so carefully chosen. He'd meant what he said. The question was, what did Grace want? The answer, when she admitted it to herself, was both simple and terrifying. She wanted Harrison. She wanted his steady presence and his dry humor and the way he made her feel safe. She wanted the possibility of a future that didn't involve being alone, of building something with someone who saw her as more than a burden. But wanting something and believing you could have it were two very different things. Over the next few weeks, Grace and Harrison settled into a new pattern. He still came to the restaurant most mornings, but now, he sometimes invited her to walk with him in the evenings after her shift ended. They'd stroll through town or out along the edges where the buildings gave way to open prairie, talking about everything and nothing. Harrison told her more about his plans for his ranch, and Grace found herself drawn into his vision. The way he described it, she could almost see the small house he wanted to build, the barn for horses and cattle, the garden that would provide vegetables through the long summer. He spoke about it with such longing that Grace ached for him, wanting him to have everything he'd worked so hard for. "What about you?" Harrison asked one evening as they sat on a bench outside the general store, watching the stars come out. "What do you want, Grace, when you think about the future?" Grace was quiet for a long moment. No one had ever asked her that before, not really. Her life had always been about surviving, about making herself as small and unobtrusive as possible despite her size. She'd never dared to dream about what she might want. "I want to matter to someone," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to be wanted, not just tolerated. I want to build something, even if it's small. I want—" She trailed off, unable to finish. "What?" Harrison prompted gently. "I want what you have," Grace said. "A dream. A purpose. Something that's mine." Harrison was quiet for a moment, and when Grace dared to glance at him, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You matter, Grace," he said quietly. "You matter to Mr. Chen, who hasn't stopped praising your work since you started. You matter to Mrs. Walker at the boarding house, who asks after you every time I see her. You matter to me." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Harrison said. "I know you're brave because you kept going even when you had every reason to give up. I know you're proud in the best way, because you insisted on earning your own way instead of taking handouts. I know you're kind, because you're patient with the customers even when they don't deserve it. I know you're stronger than you think you are." A tear slipped down Grace's cheek before she could stop it. "Harrison." He reached out and caught her hand, his calloused fingers gentle around hers. "I meant what I said before, Grace. I'd be honored if you'd consider letting me court you properly. Not because I pity you or because I'm lonely, but because I genuinely care about you. Because when I think about my future, about that ranch and that house, I keep seeing you there with me." Grace's heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. "You can't mean that." "I do mean it," Harrison said firmly. He shifted on the bench so he was facing her fully, both her hands now clasped in his. "I know this is fast. I know we haven't known each other long, but I also know that I've never met anyone who made me feel the way you do. When I'm with you, everything just makes sense. You feel like home, Grace. And I think maybe I feel that way to you too." Grace was openly crying now, unable to stop the tears or the sobs that shook her shoulders. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of wonder, of a hope so fierce it hurt. "You do," she managed to say through her tears. "You feel like home. You feel like the first good thing that's happened to me in years. But Harrison, I'm scared. I'm scared that you'll change your mind. That you'll realize I'm too much work, too much trouble. That's what my brother said. That's what everyone thinks." Harrison released one of her hands to cup her face, his thumb gently wiping away her tears. "Your brother was a fool and everyone else is wrong. You're not too much of anything, Grace. You're exactly right, and I'm not going to change my mind." "How can you be sure?" Grace whispered. "Because I know my own heart," Harrison said simply. "And my heart is telling me that you're the one I've been waiting for. The one I've been working toward all these years without even knowing it." Grace looked into his eyes, those steady creek water eyes that had shown her nothing but honesty since the day they met, and she made a choice. She chose to believe him. She chose to trust. She chose to hope. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now. "Yes, I'll let you court me. I want that. I want you." Harrison's face broke into the widest smile she'd ever seen from him, and then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her close despite the awkwardness of the bench and their positions. Grace buried her face in his shoulder and held on tight, feeling safe, and wanted for the first time in longer than she could remember. They sat there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms under the Texas stars, and Grace thought that maybe, just maybe, she'd found her place in the world after all. The next few months were the happiest Grace had ever known. Harrison courted her with a steady, determined devotion that left no room for doubt. He took her to church on Sundays and introduced her to his friends. He brought her small gifts, nothing fancy but always thoughtful. A hair ribbon that matched her eyes, a book of poetry he thought she'd enjoy, wildflowers he'd picked on his way into town. The townspeople gradually grew accustomed to seeing them together, and while there were still whispers and judgmental looks, they bothered Grace less and less. Harrison had shown her that she was worthy of love and respect, and that knowledge was armor against the cruelty of strangers. Mr. Chen had grown fond of both of them, and he often invited Harrison to share meals at the restaurant, waving away payment and insisting it was his privilege to feed his best worker and her young man. Grace's cooking had improved under his tutelage, and she'd learned to make dishes she'd never dreamed of, flavors and techniques from Mr. Chen's homeland that fascinated her. One evening in late October, as the weather was finally beginning to cool from the brutal summer heat, Harrison asked Grace to take a ride with him. He'd borrowed a wagon from the Henderson Ranch, and they drove out beyond the town limits as the sun set, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. "Where are we going?" Grace asked, content to be beside him but curious all the same. "You'll see," Harrison said, a mysterious smile playing around his mouth. They drove for about 20 minutes before Harrison pulled the wagon to a stop on a small rise overlooking a valley. Below them stretched a beautiful piece of land, maybe 100 acres or so, with a creek running through it and a stand of cottonwood trees providing shade. It was exactly the kind of place Harrison had described wanting for his ranch. "Is this it?" Grace asked, her voice hushed with awe. "The land you wanted, it is," Harrison said. "Or it will be. I made an offer last week and the owner accepted. We'll sign the papers next month. This is going to be ours, Grace." Grace turned to him, her heart full to bursting. "Ours." Harrison climbed down from the wagon and came around to help her down, then took both her hands in his. The setting sun cast golden light across his face, and his expression was more serious than Grace had ever seen it. "Grace Sutherland," he said quietly, "I know we've only known each other for a few months, but they've been the best months of my life. You make me laugh. You make me think. You make me want to be better than I am. When I look at my future now, I can't imagine it without you." Grace's breath caught as Harrison released one of her hands and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small ring. It was simple, just a thin gold band, but to Grace, it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "I don't have much to offer you yet," Harrison continued. "Just this land and a dream and a heart that's entirely yours. But if you'll have me, I promise I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it. Grace, will you marry me?" Grace was crying again, but this time she was smiling too, her whole face alight with joy. "Yes," she said, her voice ringing clear across the prairie. "Yes, Harrison, I'll marry you. My family begins with you, and that's all I need. That's everything." Harrison slipped the ring onto her finger, and then he was kissing her, his lips warm and gentle against hers. Grace melted into the kiss, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck, and for a moment the whole world consisted of nothing but the two of them and the promise of forever. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and grinning, Harrison rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Grace," he said softly. "I should have said it before now, but I love you more than I knew it was possible to love anyone." "I love you too," Grace whispered. "So much it scares me sometimes." "Don't be scared," Harrison said. "We're going to build something beautiful together. You and me." They stood there on that rise as the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars began to appear, holding each other and planning their future. Grace had never been so happy, had never felt so certain that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They were married in early November, in the small church in Amarillo with Mr. Chen and Mrs. Walker and a handful of others in attendance. Grace wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Walker had helped her sew, and Harrison wore his Sunday best with his hair slicked back and his boots polished. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Harrison kissed her in front of everyone, and Grace felt like her heart might burst from sheer joy. The townspeople had taken up a small collection as a wedding gift, and Harrison and Grace were touched by the generosity of folks who had started out as strangers. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy basic supplies for setting up their new home. They spent their first weeks as a married couple living in Grace's hotel room while they worked on preparing the land. Every evening after their respective shifts, they'd ride out to what they'd started calling the Xenon Ranch and work until dark. Harrison built a small cabin, just 2 rooms to start with but solid and weather-tight. Grace helped as much as she could, hauling water and holding boards steady while Harrison hammered. By December, the cabin was habitable, and they moved in with a sense of pride and accomplishment that made all the hard work worthwhile. It wasn't fancy. The furniture was rough-hewn and the floors were plain wood, but it was theirs. Grace hung curtains she'd sewn herself and arranged their few possessions with care, making the small space feel like home. Harrison had saved enough to buy a small herd of cattle and a few horses, and he worked from dawn to dusk building fences and preparing the land for spring. Grace continued working at Mr. Chen's restaurant, saving every penny she could toward building their future. It was hard work, but they were doing it together, and that made all the difference. Winter in the Texas Panhandle could be brutal, and that year was no exception. The winds howled across the prairie, and snow fell in heavy blankets that turned the world white. Grace and Harrison huddled close in their cabin at night, wrapped in quilts and each other's warmth, talking about their dreams for the ranch and the life they were building. "I want children," Grace said one night as they lay in bed listening to the wind rattle the windows. "At least 3 or 4. I want them to grow up knowing they're loved and wanted, not like I was." Harrison pulled her closer, his hand resting protectively on her stomach. "Then we'll have children," he said. "As many as you want, and they'll be the luckiest kids in Texas having you for a mother. "And you for a father," Grace added. "You're going to be wonderful at it." By spring, the ranch was starting to take shape. The cattle had survived the winter with minimal losses, and Harrison's careful management was paying off. They'd even acquired a few chickens, and Grace took pride in collecting eggs each morning and tending the small garden she'd planted near the house. Grace had stopped working at the restaurant in March when she discovered she was pregnant. Mr. Chen had been understanding, even delighted, though he'd made her promise to visit often and bring the baby to see him once it arrived. Grace had cried when she said goodbye to the little restaurant that had given her a start in her new life, but she was excited too. She was going to be a mother. The pregnancy was hard on her body, and Grace spent many days feeling sick and exhausted. But Harrison was endlessly patient, taking on extra work around the ranch and the house to make things easier for her. He'd massage her swollen feet in the evenings and bring her water when she was too tired to get up herself. He'd talk to her belly, telling their unborn child stories about the ranch and making silly promises that made Grace laugh despite her discomfort. "I promise to teach you to ride before you can walk," Harrison told her stomach one evening. "And I promise that your mama and I will love you no matter what. Boy or girl, doesn't matter. You're already the most important thing in the world to us." Grace ran her fingers through Harrison's hair, her heart overflowing with love for this man who had given her everything. "We're so lucky to have you," she whispered. Their son was born in early November, almost exactly a year after Grace and Harrison had married. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when Grace was terrified that something would go wrong. But the midwife from town was experienced and calm, and Harrison never left Grace's side, holding her hand and whispering encouragement even when she screamed at him that this was all his fault. When the baby finally emerged, red-faced and squalling, Grace burst into tears of relief and joy. Harrison cut the cord with shaking hands, and when the midwife placed their son on Grace's chest, both of them stared down at him in awe. "He's perfect," Harrison breathed. "Grace, look at him. He's absolutely perfect." "Hello, little one," Grace whispered, tracing her finger over the baby's tiny features. "We've been waiting for you." They named him Henry after Harrison's father, and he became the center of their world. Harrison was a devoted father, walking the floor with Henry when he cried at night and changing diapers without complaint. Grace nursed their son and sang to him and marveled at how something so small could hold so much of her heart. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Harrison's hard work and careful planning were paying off, and by the time Henry was 2 years old, they'd expanded their herd significantly and added on to the cabin, giving them 2 more rooms and a proper kitchen. Grace had become known in the area for her cooking, and she often provided meals for ranch hands during busy seasons like branding and roundup. When Henry was 3, Grace found herself pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their second son, whom they named James, was born in the spring of 1883, and he was as different from Henry as night from day. Where Henry was serious and thoughtful, James was all energy and mischief, keeping Grace on her toes from the moment he could crawl. "We're going to have our hands full with this one," Grace told Harrison one evening as they watched 2-year-old James attempt to climb onto a horse that was thankfully too patient to mind. "Good thing we've got experience then," Harrison said, grinning as he scooped up his adventurous son. "Besides, the ranch can always use another cowboy." The years passed in a blur of hard work and small joys. The ranch grew more prosperous with each passing season, and Harrison and Grace's reputation as fair, honest ranchers spread throughout the area. They hired a few hands to help with the work, and Grace made sure everyone who worked for them was treated well and fed generously. Henry grew into a quiet, studious boy who loved to read and had a gift for working with numbers. James was the opposite, always outside and getting into some kind of trouble, but with a heart of gold and a natural way with animals. Grace loved them both fiercely, and she made sure they knew every single day that they were wanted and cherished. In 1886, Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Lily. She was tiny and delicate, with Grace's dark hair and Harrison's creek water eyes, and both boys were instantly protective of their baby sister. Grace had feared that having a daughter might bring back all her old insecurities, but instead, she found it healing. She was determined that Lily would grow up knowing she was valuable for exactly who she was, regardless of what she looked like or how much space she took up in the world. "You're going to be strong and brave," Grace whispered to Lily one night as she nursed her. "And you're going to know that you matter, that you've always mattered." Harrison came to stand behind Grace's rocking chair, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "She's got you for a mother," he said softly. "She's going to be unstoppable." By the time Lily was 3, the Xenon Ranch was one of the most successful in the area. They had a comfortable house, a thriving herd, and 3 healthy, happy children. Grace had put on more weight over the years, especially after the pregnancies, but Harrison never treated her as anything less than beautiful. He still told her he loved her every single day, still held her close at night, still looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. One evening in the summer of 1889, Grace and Harrison sat on the porch of their house, watching their children play in the yard. Henry, now 9, was reading to Lily while James, 6, attempted to rope a fence post with increasingly hilarious results. "You ever think about that day?" Grace asked quietly. "The day you found me on the road?" Harrison reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "All the time," he admitted. "I think about how close I came to riding past. I was in a hurry that day, remember? Had somewhere I needed to be, but something made me stop." "I'm glad you did," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "I was so lost that day, Harrison, so sure that I was worthless and that nobody would ever want me. And then you came along and proved me wrong." Harrison raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "I didn't prove you wrong, sweetheart. I just saw what was already there. You were never worthless. You were always meant for great things." "I was meant for you," Grace said. "And for this, for them." She gestured to their children. "My family begins with you," Harrison said, echoing the words he'd spoken years ago. "That's still true, Grace. It'll always be true. You're the foundation of everything good in my life." Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks, but they were happy tears. She thought about that frightened, broken woman walking along a dusty road in the brutal Texas heat. She thought about the cowboy who'd stopped to help her, asking nothing in return. She thought about everything they'd built together, every challenge they'd overcome, every moment of joy they'd shared. "I love you," Grace said, "more than words can say." "I love you too," Harrison replied, "more than anything in this world." They sat there as the sun set, hand in hand, watching their children and counting their blessings. It hadn't been easy building this life. There had been hard times and lean years, sickness and setbacks and moments when Grace had wondered if they'd make it through. But they had. Together, they'd created something beautiful and lasting. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own challenges and triumphs. The children grew, and the ranch grew with them. Henry eventually went to college, something Grace insisted on even though Harrison thought ranch work was education enough. He came back with a degree in business and new ideas for managing the ranch that helped them become even more successful. James, true to form, never had much interest in books but became one of the best horsemen in the county. He had his father's steady temperament and his mother's kind heart, and he was loved by everyone who knew him. Lily grew into a strong, confident young woman who could outride and outrope many of the ranch hands while still maintaining the gentle spirit that made her so special. She had her mother's determination and her father's practicality, and Grace knew she would do great things with her life. In 1895, when Grace was 40 years old and Harrison was 43, they celebrated their 14th wedding anniversary. The children organized a party at the ranch, inviting friends and neighbors from all over the county. Mr. Chen, now elderly but still running his restaurant, made the journey out to the ranch with his wife and children, bearing dishes that made Grace cry with nostalgia. "You have built a beautiful life," Mr. Chen told Grace as they stood together watching the celebration. "I am honored to have been part of it. You gave me my start," Grace said, hugging him tight. "I'll never forget that, never forget your kindness." As the sun began to set and the party wound down, Harrison pulled Grace away from the crowd and led her up to the same rise where he'd proposed all those years ago. The land below them had changed. Where there had once been empty prairie, there was now a thriving ranch with multiple buildings, fenced pastures, and hundreds of head of cattle. But the creek still ran through the valley, and the cottonwood trees still provided shade. "You remember standing here with me?" Harrison asked, pulling Grace close. "Of course I do," Grace said. "It was the best day of my life." "Mine too," Harrison said. He turned her to face him, his creek water eyes as clear and honest as they'd been that first day. "I want you to know something, Grace. Every single day since then has been a gift. Every morning I wake up next to you, every meal we share, every moment watching our children grow up. All of it has been more than I ever dreamed possible." "Harrison," Grace whispered, her heart full to overflowing. "I know I tell you all the time that I love you," Harrison continued, "but I want you to understand just how much. You saved me that day on the road, just as surely as I saved you. You gave me purpose and direction and a reason to build something lasting. You gave me a family, Grace. You gave me everything." Grace cupped his face in her hands, looking into the eyes of the man who had seen her worth when no one else had. "My family begins with you," she said, her voice steady and sure. "That's what you told me once. It was true then, and it's true now. Everything good in my life started the day you stopped on that road. Everything." They kissed as the sun set behind them, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something remarkable together. Below them, their children laughed and played, secure in the love of their parents and the life they'd been given. The ranch stretched out in every direction, a testament to hard work and determination, and the power of believing in something bigger than yourself. Grace had been cast out by her blood family, told she was worthless and unwanted. But she'd found a new family, one built on love and respect and mutual devotion. She'd found a man who saw her for who she really was and loved her not despite her flaws, but because of everything she was. As darkness fell and the stars began to appear, Grace thought back to that desperate woman walking along a dusty road, certain her life was over. If she could go back and tell that woman what the future held, she wouldn't believe it. The happiness, the love, the family, the success. It would all seem too impossible, too much like a dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. It was her life, the life she'd built with Harrison Xenon by her side. And as they stood together under the vast Texas sky, Grace knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly the person she was meant to be with. Ready to go back down? Harrison asked after a while, nodding toward the house where lights were beginning to appear in the windows. Grace smiled and took his hand. "Ready," she said. They walked down the hill together, toward the home they'd built and the family that waited for them, and Grace's heart was full of gratitude for every twist and turn that had brought her to this moment. She had been lost, and she had been found. She had been rejected, and she had been chosen. She had been told she was too much, and she had found someone who thought she was exactly enough. In the years that followed, Grace and Harrison grew old together, watching their children marry and have children of their own. The ranch passed eventually to Henry and James, who ran it together with the same dedication their parents had shown. Lily married a kind schoolteacher and moved to town, but she visited often with her growing family. Grace's hair turned gray, and her body grew even heavier with age, but Harrison never stopped looking at her with love. He'd stroke her hair as they sat together on the porch in the evenings, and he'd tell her stories about their life, about the day they met, and the first time he'd known he loved her, and all the moments in between that had made their life together so rich. "You have any regrets?" Grace asked him once when they were both well into their 60s and the children had children of their own running around the ranch. Harrison thought for a moment, his weathered face serious. Then he smiled and shook his head. "Not a single one," he said. "Except maybe that I didn't find you sooner. But then again, maybe we weren't ready for each other before that day. Maybe we both had to go through what we went through to become the people who could build this life together." "I think you're right," Grace said softly. "I think everything happened exactly the way it was supposed to." When Harrison died in 1912, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 60, Grace grieved deeply, but without bitterness. They'd had 33 years together, years filled with more love and happiness than most people experienced in a lifetime. She'd been his wife, his partner, his best friend, and she knew that not a day had passed when he hadn't been grateful for her presence in his life. Grace lived for another 8 years after Harrison's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She told them stories about their grandfather, about the cowboy who'd stopped on a dusty road to help a woman everyone else had discarded. She told them about building the ranch from nothing, about hard times and good times, about the power of love to transform lives. When Grace Sutherland Xenon died in the spring of 1920, she was 75 years old and surrounded by family. Her last words were about Harrison, about how she couldn't wait to see him again. And as her children and grandchildren gathered around her bed, they knew that she'd lived a life of purpose and meaning, that she'd mattered deeply to so many people, and that her legacy would live on in the generations that followed. The Xenon Ranch still stood, a thriving operation run by Henry's sons and daughters. In the house, now much expanded from the original 2-room cabin, there hung a painting that Grace had commissioned years before. It showed a dusty road stretching into the distance, and a single cowboy on a paint horse approaching a solitary figure with a carpetbag. It was labeled simply, "The Day Everything Changed," because that's what it had been. The day a woman who'd been told she was worthless discovered she was priceless. The day a cowboy looking for purpose found his true calling. The day 2 lonely people found each other and decided to build a family, a life, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Grace Sutherland had been cast out by her kin, left to die on a Texas road with nothing but $20 and a broken heart. But Harrison Xenon had stopped and said, in words and actions that would echo through the decades, "My family begins with you if you'll have me." And she had. She'd taken that chance, embraced that love, and together they'd created something beautiful. Something that proved that worth isn't measured by the number on a scale or the opinions of small-minded people, but by the content of one's character and the love one carries in one's heart. Their story became legend in that part of Texas, told and retold by generations of Xenons and the people whose lives they'd touched. It was a story about kindness and courage, about choosing love when the world says you should choose judgment, about building a family not from blood but from choice and commitment and unwavering devotion. It was a story about two people who found each other when they needed it most, and who spent the rest of their lives proving that sometimes the best families are the ones we create for ourselves. That sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about princes and princesses, but about real people with real struggles who choose each other every single day. And it all started on a dusty road in Texas, when a cowboy stopped to help a woman nobody else wanted, and in doing so, found everything he'd ever been looking for. The Xenon Ranch prospered for generations, and every person who grew up there learned the story of Grace and Harrison. They learned that kindness matters, that love transforms, and that family is about so much more than blood. They learned that everyone has worth, regardless of what they look like or where they come from, and that the greatest legacy anyone can leave is a life lived with integrity and compassion. Grace and Harrison had started with nothing but each other and a dream. They'd built an empire of love that would endure long after the buildings crumbled and the fences fell. Because the most important things they'd created weren't the ranch or the house or the material success. The most important things were the values they'd instilled in their children, the love they'd shown each other every single day, and the proof that one act of kindness on a dusty road could change everything. Their graves stood side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, two simple headstones marking the final resting place of two remarkable people. But they weren't really there. They lived on in every person who heard their story and chose kindness. They lived on in every act of compassion shown to someone the world had discarded. They lived on in the knowledge that love, real love, sees past surfaces to the heart beneath. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered across the Texas prairie and the stars shone bright overhead, some said you could still see them on that hill where Harrison had proposed. Two figures standing close together, looking out over the land they'd built and the family they'd created, forever together in the place where their story had truly begun, because some love stories never really end. They just become part of the landscape, woven into the very fabric of the land and the people who call it home. And the story of Grace and Harrison Xenon was one such story, a testament to the power of choosing love over judgment, acceptance over rejection, and hope over despair. It was a story that proved, beyond any doubt, that family begins not with blood but with choice, with the simple, profound decision to see another person's worth and to say, "My family begins with you if you'll have me." And Grace had said yes. She'd said yes to love, yes to family, yes to a future she'd never dared to dream possible. And in saying yes, she'd found not just a husband and a home, but herself. The strong, capable, worthy woman she'd always been, but had never been allowed to become. Harrison had given her that. He'd given her the space to grow, and the love to flourish, and the belief that she deserved all the good things life had to offer. And she'd given him the same, creating a partnership that was greater than either of them could have been alone. Their story was extraordinary, but it was also beautifully ordinary. It was about two people doing their best, working hard, loving each other, and building something lasting. It was about facing challenges together and celebrating triumphs together and never, ever giving up on each other. It was the kind of story that reminds us why love matters, why kindness matters, why every single person we encounter deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Because we never know when we might be entertaining angels unaware, Never know when the person we help might become the most important person in our life. Harrison Xenon had stopped on a road in Texas to help a desperate woman, and in doing so, he'd found his destiny. Grace Sutherland had accepted help from a stranger, and in doing so, she'd found her home. Together, they'd proven that the most powerful force in the world isn't violence or cruelty or the judgment of others. It's love. Simple, honest, steadfast love. The kind of love that sees a person for who they really are and says, "Yes, you, I choose you." The kind of love that builds families and ranches and legacies that endure for generations. The kind of love that changes everything. And it all started with a cowboy on a dusty road, willing to stop and help. And a woman brave enough to accept that help and build something beautiful from it. Together, they'd created a love story for the ages, one that would be told and retold as long as there were Xenons walking the earth and working the land their ancestors had built. Because that's what great love stories do. They transcend the individuals involved and become something bigger, something that speaks to the human experience in all its messy, complicated, beautiful glory. They remind us that we all have worth, that we all deserve love, and that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. Grace and Harrison's story did all that and more. It was a beacon of hope for anyone who'd ever felt unwanted or unworthy. It was proof that one person's opinion, even family, doesn't define your value. It was a reminder that the right person will see you for who you truly are and love you not despite your perceived flaws but simply because you're you. And in the end, isn't that what we're all looking for? Someone who sees us, truly sees us and chooses us anyway. Someone who says, "My family begins with you," and means it with every fiber of their being. Grace and Harrison found that in each other. They built a life on that foundation of mutual respect and love and unwavering commitment. And in doing so, they created something that would outlast them both, a legacy of love that would inspire generations to come. Their story ended, as all stories must, with death. But the love they'd shared, the family they'd built, and the example they'd set lived on. And that, in the end, is the greatest legacy anyone can leave. Not wealth or property or earthly possessions, but love. Pure, transformative, enduring love. The kind of love that begins with a simple offer of help on a dusty Texas road. The kind of love that says, "My family begins with you if you'll have me." The kind of love that changes two lives and creates ripples that spread outward, touching everyone they encounter. That was the legacy of Grace and Harrison Xenon. And it was a legacy worth celebrating, worth remembering, and worth striving to emulate in our own lives. Because if they could find each other and build something so beautiful from such humble beginnings, then maybe we all can. Maybe we all have the capacity to be that person for someone else, to see past surfaces to the soul beneath, and to offer love when the world offers judgment. Their story proved it's possible. Their lives demonstrated it's worthwhile. And their legacy ensures that future generations will know that sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about perfect people in perfect circumstances. They're about imperfect people choosing each other and building something perfect from that choice. And that's exactly what Grace and Harrison did. They chose each other, they chose love, and they chose to build a family and a life that would stand as a testament to the power of those choices. It wasn't always easy. There were challenges and setbacks and moments of doubt. But they faced everything together, hand in hand, heart to heart, and they came out stronger on the other side. That's what real love does. It doesn't promise a life without problems. It promises a partner to face those problems with. It doesn't guarantee smooth sailing. It guarantees someone to help bail when the boat takes on water. It doesn't eliminate pain or difficulty. It provides comfort and support through those difficult times. Grace and Harrison understood that. They lived it every single day of their 33 years together. And in doing so, they created something rare and precious. A love story that would be remembered long after they were gone, inspiring others to choose kindness, to embrace love, and to believe that family truly does begin with choice. Their story, which began on a dusty road in 1878, became part of the mythology of the American West. It was told around campfires and dinner tables, in schoolhouses and churches, passed down from generation to generation as both history and inspiration. And every time it was told, the message remained the same. Love transforms, kindness matters, and family is what you make it. Grace, Sutherland Xenon, and Harrison Xenon proved that beyond any doubt. They took two broken pieces and made them whole. They built something lasting from nothing. They created a love story that would echo through eternity, reminding everyone who heard it that we all have worth, we all deserve love, and we're all capable of creating something beautiful if we're brave enough to try. And it all started with a simple question on a dusty Texas road. "Where you headed?" Grace's answer had been, "Anywhere that isn't here." But Harrison had shown her a better destination, home, not a place but a person, not a location but a love. And in finding that home in each other, they'd created a sanctuary for themselves and for generations to come, a place where everyone was welcome, everyone was valued, and everyone knew they mattered. That was the true legacy of Grace and Harrison Xenon. Not the ranch, impressive as it was. Not the material success, important as that might be. But the simple, profound truth that family begins with love, and love begins with a choice. The choice to see another person's worth. The choice to offer help without expecting anything in return. The choice to say, "My family begins with you if you'll have me," and mean it with every beat of your heart. Grace had said yes to that offer. And in doing so, she'd found everything she'd ever wanted and more than she'd ever dreamed possible. She'd found love, family, purpose, and a place where she belonged. She'd found herself. And in the finding, she'd helped Harrison find himself too, creating a partnership that was truly greater than the sum of its parts. Their story was complete now, told from beginning to end, from that first meeting on a dusty road to their final resting place on a hill overlooking everything they'd built. It was a story of triumph over adversity, of love conquering judgment, of two people brave enough to choose each other when the world said they shouldn't. And as the sun set over the Xenon Ranch one final time in our telling, casting long shadows across the land Grace and Harrison had loved so well, their story became part of the eternal, enduring truth that love, real love, never dies. It transforms, it evolves, it passes from one generation to the next, but it never truly ends, because love like theirs, built on respect and kindness and unwavering commitment, becomes part of the very fabric of the world. It changes things in ways both large and small, creating ripples that spread outward infinitely, touching lives that will never even know their names but will benefit from the example they set. That was the power of their story. That was the gift they gave to the world. And that was why, more than a century after that cowboy stopped on that road to help that woman, their story still mattered, still inspired, still reminded everyone who heard it that we're all capable of creating something beautiful if we're willing to take that first brave step. For Harrison, that step was stopping to help. For Grace, it was accepting that help and believing she deserved it. Together, those two simple actions created a cascade of moments that built into a life, a family, and a legacy that would endure as long as people told stories about love and courage, and the power of choosing kindness over cruelty. Their story was finished now, complete in every way that mattered. From casting out to choosing, from loneliness to love, from despair to joy, from two separate people to one united family. It was a story with a beginning, a middle and an end, but whose impact would continue forever. And somewhere, perhaps, Grace and Harrison were together still, looking down on the ranch they'd built and the family they'd created, smiling at how far they'd come from that dusty road where it all began. Together in eternity as they'd been together in life, proof that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones where people choose each other not because they have to, but because they want to, because family truly does begin with choice. And Grace and Harrison Xenon had chosen each other, completely and forever. That choice had made all the difference.